"Don't answer that call," she said, her voice quiet but certain. And for a moment the entire table seemed to pause as Daniel Whitmore's hand hovered inches above his phone, the screen glowing against the polished wood, flashing a name that usually meant millions of dollars could move in seconds. And he almost ignored her, because men like him didn't take advice from waitresses, especially not in places like this where the lighting was soft, the music low, and everything was designed to remind him he was in control. But there was something different about her, something in the way Emily Carter stood there, not nervous, not apologizing, just watching, as if she already knew how this would end. And outside, the floor-to-ceiling windows rain tapped steadily against the glass, turning the city lights into blurred streaks of gold and white. While inside, Daniel adjusted his cuff, the weight of his Swiss watch pressing against his wrist, grounding him in logic, in routine, in everything that had made him successful. Because calls like this didn't just happen, they were scheduled, expected, calculated. And yet the phone kept ringing, once, twice, 3 times, persistent, insistent, almost too perfect. And Emily didn't move, didn't explain, didn't try to convince him with words. She simply said it again, softer this time. "Please, don't." And that single word hung heavier than it should have, slipping past his instincts and settling somewhere deeper, somewhere he didn't usually listen to. But pride was louder, and with a faint, dismissive smile, Daniel picked up the phone, bringing it to his ear as his gaze stayed on her, almost as if he wanted to prove her wrong. And the voice on the other end was smooth, familiar, confident, introducing itself with the exact tone and phrasing of someone he trusted, referencing details from a deal that hadn't even been announced yet. And for half a second, everything aligned, everything made sense, until it didn't, until one small detail landed wrong, just slightly off, like a note in a song that shouldn't be there. And Daniel's expression shifted, barely noticeable, but enough for the world around him to fade into silence as he listened more carefully, his grip tightening on the phone, his mind recalculating, reprocessing, because something about this was too precise, too clean, too rehearsed. And slowly, almost reluctantly, he lowered the phone from his ear, the call still connected, the voice still talking, but no longer in control. And when he looked back at Emily, she wasn't surprised. She wasn't even watching him anymore. She had already turned, already moving away with the same quiet composure she had before, as if this outcome had never been in question. And only then did Daniel realize that whatever had just happened, she had seen it coming long before he ever did. Daniel did not end the call right away. He simply held the phone in his hand, listening as the voice continued with unnatural precision, offering reassurance, urgency, authority, all the right elements arranged too perfectly. And that was the problem, because in his world perfection was never real. It was negotiated, flawed, human. And this voice had no hesitation, no overlap, no breath between sentences, just a seamless flow that now felt manufactured. And slowly he pressed the screen and disconnected. The silence that followed heavier than the call itself as the faint sound of rain returned to fill the space, tapping against the glass like a quiet reminder that the world outside was still real, still unpredictable, unlike what he had just heard. And for a moment Daniel remained still, his mind running through every detail, every word, every inflection, matching it against memory, searching for the crack he had just sensed. And then he saw it clearly, one reference to a meeting that had been moved 30 minutes earlier, a change only 3 people in his company knew about, and none of them would have spoken the way that voice did. Not like that, not so smooth, not so exact. And something cold settled in his chest, not fear, but recognition, the realization that someone had come close, closer than he was comfortable admitting. And when he finally looked up, Emily was already at another table, pouring water with steady hands, her posture unchanged, her expression neutral, as if nothing unusual had happened at all, which somehow made it more unsettling, because for her this was not surprising. This was expected. And Daniel stood slowly, adjusting his jacket, his attention no longer on the deal he had been reviewing but entirely on her, on the quiet certainty she carried without explanation. And as he approached, he noticed the small details he had ignored before, the way her eyes moved, scanning, observing, not in a curious way, but in a deliberate one, like someone trained to notice patterns others overlooked, and when she turned toward him, there was no defensiveness, no anticipation, just calm. And that calm irritated him more than anything else because it suggested she had never doubted herself for a second. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier edge, and for the first time she paused, not to think, but to decide how much to say. Her gaze meeting his evenly as the ambient noise of the restaurant faded into the background, and she glanced briefly at the phone still in his hand before looking back at him. "The timing was wrong," she said simply, then added after a beat. "And the silence between the rings," and Daniel frowned slightly, because that answer was not enough, not for someone like him who built entire systems on data and explanation. But she did not elaborate. She did not fill the silence. She simply waited, and that was when he realized that whatever she knew, she was not trying to impress him with it. She was not trying to prove anything at all, and that made her more dangerous than the call itself, because it meant she was operating on a level he had not yet seen. And as he looked at her, really looked this time, Daniel understood one thing with absolute clarity. This was not the first time she had done something like this, and it would not be the last. Emily did not return to his table right away. She continued her routine with quiet precision, refilling glasses, clearing plates, moving through the space as if nothing had shifted, but Daniel could not unsee what had just happened. The way she had intercepted something invisible, something designed to pass unnoticed. And as he stood there, watching her from a distance of barely 10 feet, he realized how easily he would have accepted that call without question, how naturally he would have followed its instructions, and the thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit, because his entire career had been built on control, on anticipating risks before they formed. Yet tonight, in a place where he should have been the most relaxed, he had almost missed something critical, and she had not. And when Emily finally returned, placing a fresh glass of water in front of him without meeting his eyes, Daniel noticed the steadiness in her hands. No tremor, no hesitation, just the same calm rhythm, as if she had already moved on. "You said the timing was wrong," he continued, his voice quieter now, less demanding, more searching, and she gave a small nod, setting the pitcher down carefully. "Calls like that do not come during transitions," she said, her tone even. "They wait until you are settled, until your attention is fully on them." And Daniel frowned slightly, because she was right. Every high-level call he had ever taken followed a pattern, a rhythm of preparation and control, not interruption, not urgency without context. And yet he had almost ignored that instinct because of the label on the screen, because of the illusion of authority. And Emily glanced briefly at his phone again, as if confirming something only she could see, before adding, "And the number, it mirrored one you already trust, but it was off by one digit." And that was when Daniel felt the full weight of it, the precision of the attempt, the intentional design meant to bypass logic and trigger habit. And he exhaled slowly, his mind reconstructing the moment with new clarity, realizing how close the deception had come to succeeding. And when he looked back at her, there was no pride in her expression, no sense of accomplishment, just quiet certainty, and that unsettled him even more, because it meant she was not reacting, she was recognizing, and recognition came from experience, not chance. "You have seen this before," he said, not as a question but as a statement, and for the first time there was a flicker in her eyes, not fear, not hesitation, just a brief acknowledgement before it disappeared. And she picked up the check presenter from the table, aligning it perfectly with the edge, a small, precise movement that seemed almost deliberate. "Patterns repeat," she replied softly, and Daniel studied her for a long moment, realizing that every answer she gave was only a fraction of the truth, carefully measured, never excessive, as if she understood exactly how much to reveal and when to stop. And as the rain outside grew heavier, the city lights dimming behind the glass, one thought settled clearly in his mind. This was not coincidence. This was not instinct alone. Whatever Emily Carter had just prevented, she had been prepared for it long before his phone ever rang. Daniel did not sit down again. Instead, he remained standing beside the table, one hand resting lightly on the back of the chair, as if grounding himself in something solid, something real, because the more he replayed the last few minutes in his mind, the more it unsettled him, not the call itself, but how easily it had almost worked, how naturally he had followed the script laid out for him, and how effortlessly Emily had stepped outside of it. And across the room, she continued moving with that same quiet rhythm. But now he noticed more. The way her gaze lingered just a fraction longer on certain details. The way she seemed to register patterns without needing to look directly at them. Like someone listening to a conversation beneath the noise. And when she approached again, this time carrying a small tray with a single cup of coffee he had not ordered, she placed it in front of him without explanation, the steam rising slowly between them. "You need something warm," she said, her tone neutral, but there was a subtle weight behind it, as if she understood that what had just happened would take a moment to settle. And Daniel glanced at the cup before looking back at her, studying her more openly now, no longer dismissing, no longer assuming. "You said that was the second attempt," he said, his voice steady but quieter than before, and for a brief second she hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but calculation, deciding whether to continue, and then she gave a small nod. "The first one came while you were in the private room," she replied, her eyes briefly shifting toward the back of the restaurant where the VIP section was separated by glass and shadow. "You ignored it." And Daniel's brow furrowed slightly as he tried to recall, and then he remembered the vibration in his pocket earlier, the call he had dismissed without thinking because he was in the middle of a discussion, and a faint chill moved through him. Because if he had answered that one, there would have been no interruption, no witness, no reason to question it. And Emily continued, her voice still calm, still measured. "They adjusted after that, changed the label, changed the timing." And Daniel let out a slow breath, realizing the level of precision involved, the patience, the observation, the understanding of his behavior. And it was not just unsettling, it was personal. And for the first time that evening, his focus shifted completely away from the deal he had been working on, away from the numbers, the contracts, the expectations, and onto the person standing in front of him. "How long have you been watching this?" he asked, and this time there was no edge in his voice, only curiosity, real curiosity, the kind that did not come with assumptions. And Emily met his gaze for a moment before looking away, her eyes settling on the rain outside as it traced slow lines down the glass. "Long enough to know they were getting closer," she said softly, and there was something in that answer that carried more weight than the words themselves, something unspoken, something that suggested this was not just about one call or one night. And Daniel felt it immediately, the shift beneath the surface, the realization that whatever she had just protected him from was part of something larger, something still unfolding. And as he stood there, the coffee untouched, the restaurant moving around them in quiet motion, one thought settled firmly in his mind: this was not over, not even close, and Emily Carter knew it. Daniel did not touch the coffee, the steam slowly fading as the warmth between them shifted into something sharper, more focused, because now it was no longer just about what had almost happened. It was about what was still coming, and he could feel it, not as fear, but as a disruption to the system he trusted, the structure that had always kept him ahead. And Emily's words echoed in his mind. They were getting closer, not might, not could, but were, as if she had been tracking something in motion, something evolving. And he finally pulled out his phone again, this time not to answer, but to examine, scrolling through recent calls, timestamps, patterns, looking for anything that matched what she had described. And there it was, the earlier call she had mentioned, the one he had ignored without a second thought, sitting quietly in the log like a missed detail in an otherwise perfect report. And for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt the uncomfortable awareness of a blind spot, something that had been there all along but never noticed. And when he looked up, Emily was no longer at his table. She had moved back toward the service station, speaking quietly with another staff member. But even from a distance he could see that same composed presence, unchanged, unaffected, as if she had already processed everything he was still trying to understand. And that contrast unsettled him more than the call itself, because it meant she was operating with information he did not have, and that was not a position he was used to being in. And he made a decision then, not impulsive, not emotional, but deliberate, the kind that had built his career. And he walked toward her again, slower this time, more aware, more precise. And when she noticed him approaching, she did not react, did not brace. She simply finished what she was doing and turned to face him, meeting his gaze with the same quiet steadiness. and Daniel spoke without pretense, without the usual layers of control. "This is not random," he said, his voice low but clear, and she gave the slightest nod, confirming what he already suspected, and for a brief moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy with understanding. And then he added, "They knew exactly when to call, what to say, how to sound," and Emily's eyes flickered slightly, acknowledging the precision. "They are learning," she replied, and those 3 words landed deeper than anything else she had said so far, because they implied progression, adaptation, something that would not stop unless it was stopped. And Daniel felt his perspective shift again, from reaction to strategy, from confusion to intent, and he studied her carefully, not as a waitress now, but as someone positioned within the same problem from a different angle, someone who had seen it forming before it reached him. "You have been tracking this," he said, and this time she did not look away, did not deflect. She held his gaze for a second longer than before, just enough to confirm without speaking, and that was all he needed, because in that moment, Daniel Whitmore understood something with complete clarity. The most important person in the room was not the one with the contract, or the money, or the title. It was the one who had seen the threat before it arrived, and as the rain outside began to ease, the city lights sharpening again through the glass, one realization settled quietly but firmly in his mind. If he wanted to stay ahead of what was coming next, he could not do it alone, and whether she intended to or not, Emily Carter was already part of the answer. Daniel did not hesitate this time, the decision forming with the same clarity he reserved for billion-dollar moves, except this one felt different, quieter, more personal. And as he stood across from Emily, the noise of the restaurant fading into a distant hum, he realized something he had not admitted in years, that control was not about knowing everything. It was about knowing when you did not. And she had seen something he had missed, something that had slipped through systems designed to prevent exactly this. And that alone was enough. "Walk with me," he said, not as a command, but as an invitation. And for a brief moment, Emily did not move, her eyes studying him as if weighing the shift in tone, the absence of arrogance, the presence of something else, something closer to respect. And then she nodded once, setting down the tray in her hands before stepping beside him as they moved toward the quieter edge of the restaurant near the glass wall, where the rain had slowed to a soft mist and the city lights reflected in long, steady lines. And Daniel spoke without looking at her at first, his gaze fixed on the reflection of his own silhouette in the window. "If they are learning, then they are watching," he said, the words measured, deliberate, and Emily did not respond immediately, which told him more than any quick answer could have, because silence, in her case, was never empty. It was confirmation, and after a moment she added, "They adapt to behavior," her voice low, almost blending with the ambient sound around them. "They do not guess, they observe." And Daniel nodded slowly, the implication settling in, because observation meant access, proximity, time, and that narrowed the possibilities in a way he understood well. And for the first time since the call, his mind began to shift fully into strategy, mapping variables, considering entry points, tracing patterns backward instead of forward. And then he turned slightly toward her, his expression no longer guarded but focused. "And you saw this before it reached me," he said, not as praise, not as accusation, but as fact. And Emily met his gaze with that same calm steadiness, the kind that did not seek approval or recognition. "I noticed the first attempt pattern 2 weeks ago," she replied, "and that was when everything changed. Because 2 weeks meant this was not sudden, not isolated, it had been building, evolving." And Daniel felt a quiet tension rise, not panic, but urgency, the kind that sharpened his instincts instead of clouding them. "Why did you not report it?" he asked, and this time there was a subtle shift in her expression, not defensive, not hesitant, but something more grounded, more certain. "Because no one would have listened," she said simply, and the truth of that statement landed without resistance. Because he knew it was correct, because he himself would not have listened, not without proof, not without impact. And he exhaled slowly, acknowledging it without words, and for a moment they stood there in silence again, watching the city beyond the glass, the movement of headlights, the rhythm of a world that continued without noticing what had almost happened inside. And then Daniel spoke again, quieter now, more deliberate than ever. "I am listening now." And for the first time, something changed in Emily's expression, not a smile, not relief, but a slight softening, as if a door had opened just enough to let the truth pass through, and she nodded once, not in agreement, but in acceptance. Because this was no longer a warning, no longer a single moment. It was the beginning of something neither of them could ignore, and as the last drops of rain traced down the glass, Daniel understood with complete certainty that whatever came next, the advantage no longer belonged to whoever was watching from the outside. It belonged to the one person who had already seen them coming. The shift was subtle, but it was there, something unspoken settling between them as Daniel stood beside Emily, no longer questioning whether she was right, but beginning to understand how much she had not yet said, and that realization carried weight, because in his world information was leverage, and she was holding back more than she revealed, not out of secrecy, but out of discipline. And that alone told him she had done this before, not once, not by accident, but repeatedly, enough to recognize patterns before they fully formed. And as he looked at her, the reflection of city lights moving slowly across the glass behind them, he made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable just an hour earlier. "Show me," he said, his voice steady, direct, without hesitation, and for the first time she did not respond immediately, her eyes searching his face as if confirming something deeper than the words themselves, something about intent, about readiness, and then she turned, slightly, reaching into the pocket of her apron, pulling out a small folded receipt, the paper worn at the edges as if it had been handled more than once, and she placed it on the narrow ledge beside the window between them, not handing it to him, just setting it there, and Daniel glanced down, noticing a series of numbers written neatly along the margin, timestamps, short notes, nothing obvious, nothing dramatic. But as he leaned closer, the pattern began to emerge, calls, missed calls, durations, all aligned with specific times of day, and his expression tightened slightly as recognition set in, because these were not random, they followed a rhythm, a deliberate sequence that mirrored his own schedule, his own habits, and when he looked back at her, there was no need for explanation. She simply said, "They test first," her voice low, controlled, "then they refine," and Daniel nodded slowly, tracing the sequence with his eyes again, seeing it now not as isolated moments, but as a system, an approach designed to learn him before reaching him. And that was when it became clear, this was not about access, it was about accuracy, and accuracy took time, observation, patience, all the things he himself valued, which meant whoever was behind this understood his world more than they should. And he exhaled quietly, his mind already shifting toward countermeasures. But something stopped him, something small but important, and he looked back at her, studying her more carefully than before. "You have been documenting this," he said, and she gave a slight nod, not proud, not defensive, just factual, and he glanced at the receipt again, realizing what it represented, not just data, but attention, consistency, discipline, the kind that did not come from curiosity, but from purpose. And for a moment the weight of that settled in, because this was not her job, not her responsibility, yet she had done it anyway, quietly, without recognition, without expectation, and that realization shifted something in him again, deeper this time, beyond strategy, beyond control, into something more fundamental, respect. And as he straightened, folding the receipt carefully in his hand, he spoke with a clarity that carried no arrogance, no assumption, only intent. "We stopped them before they reached the next step," and Emily met his gaze, her expression unchanged but her eyes sharper now, more focused, as if aligning with his direction without needing agreement, and she gave a single, quiet response. "Then we do not wait for the call." And in that moment, standing between the fading rain and the reflection of a city that never slowed, Daniel Whitmore understood that this was no longer a reaction. It was a shift, a reversal, because the ones who had been watching him were no longer ahead. Not anymore. Not when the person beside him had already been watching them first. Daniel did not return to his seat, the receipt still in his hand as he studied the sequence one more time, not for confirmation but for intention, because now it was clear this was not a single attempt. It was a process, a slow tightening pattern designed to get closer with each iteration. And as he looked up, Emily was already moving again, not away from him, but ahead of him, her steps quiet, purposeful, as if she had already mapped the next move in her mind. And he followed without being asked, not out of habit, but because for the first time that evening, he recognized that she was not reacting to events, she was anticipating them. And they stopped near the far end of the room where the lighting dimmed slightly and the reflections in the glass became clearer than the view outside, and Emily turned just enough to glance at his phone, still in his hand. "They will call again," she said, not as a guess, but as certainty. And Daniel nodded slowly, already expecting it now, already thinking ahead instead of behind. "Then we let them," he replied, his voice measured, controlled, and for a brief moment there was a pause, a shift, as if the balance between them had adjusted again, because this was no longer her warning alone, it was a shared decision, and Emily's eyes met his, steady, evaluating, and then she gave a small nod, not agreeing blindly, but aligning with the logic, but not the way they expect. She added, and Daniel's expression sharpened slightly, because that was the difference, expectation, the pattern they had been using against him, and now it could be reversed, and he unlocked his phone, scrolling quickly before placing it face down on the narrow surface beside them, no longer reacting to it, no longer giving it control, and the silence stretched just long enough to feel intentional. And then, as if on cue, the vibration came again, subtle but unmistakable, the same number pattern, the same illusion of familiarity, and this time Daniel did not reach for it. He simply looked at Emily, and she did not look at the phone at all, her gaze fixed on him, waiting, measuring, and after a second he flipped the phone over, not to answer, but to observe, watching the screen light up, the name slightly altered, refined, closer than before, and a faint, almost imperceptible exhale left him, not relief, but recognition, because she had been right about that too. They were adjusting in real time, and Emily spoke quietly, her voice calm but precise. "They are watching for hesitation," and Daniel understood immediately, because hesitation was data, reaction was data. Everything he did fed the pattern, and for the first time he chose stillness, complete stillness, letting the call ring without interruption, without rejection, without engagement, and the seconds stretched, 5, 10, 15, longer than before, as if the system on the other end was waiting, recalibrating. And then the call ended on its own, not abruptly, but deliberately, and the silence that followed felt different this time, not reactive, but controlled, and Daniel glanced at Emily, a subtle shift in his expression, something close to acknowledgement. "They expected me to answer," he said, and she nodded once. "Or to decline," she added, and that was when it clicked fully. The pattern they had built depended on his response, and by removing it, by stepping outside of it, he had broken the sequence, even if only slightly, and Daniel leaned back just enough to feel the shift in control, the quiet reversal taking place beneath the surface. And for the first time since the phone had rung that night, he was not catching up, he was ahead, and as the city lights steadied beyond the glass and the last traces of rain disappeared into the pavement below, one thought settled clearly between them. This was no longer about stopping a call, it was about changing the pattern, and now, finally, the pattern was changing. The phone remained still on the table, dark now, silent, but the weight of what had just happened did not fade with the screen, it lingered in the space between them. In the quiet understanding that something invisible had shifted, and Daniel did not reach for it again, not out of caution, but out of control, because for the first time that night, he was not reacting to the call, he was deciding what it meant, and across from him Emily stood with that same composed presence, her attention no longer on the device, but on him, as if confirming that he had crossed the threshold she had been waiting for. And after a moment, he let out a slow breath, his posture easing just slightly, not in relief, but in clarity. "They stopped early," he said, more to himself than to her, and she gave a small nod, her voice quiet, certain, because the pattern broke. And that was it, simple, precise. The entire system they had built depended on expectation, on response, on predictability, and the moment that disappeared, so did their advantage. And Daniel glanced once more at the receipt in his hand before folding it carefully and placing it inside his jacket, not as evidence, but as acknowledgement, because what she had done was not just prevent a call, She had changed the way he saw the problem entirely. And as he turned back toward the main dining area, the restaurant felt different now. The same low music, the same soft lighting, the same quiet conversations. But beneath it all, something had sharpened, his awareness no longer filtered by assumption, and Emily stepped back slightly, giving him space without distance. And for a moment neither of them spoke. The silence no longer heavy, but settled, as if the most important part of the conversation had already happened. And then Daniel looked at her, really looked this time, not as a role, not as a position, but as a presence, steady, observant, intentional. And he said simply, "You saw them before I did." And she did not deny it, did not soften it. She only replied, "I listened differently." And that answer stayed with him, because it was not about knowledge, it was about attention, the kind that did not need authority to exist. And he gave a slight nod, accepting it fully, no hesitation, no resistance. And then he reached for his phone one last time, not to check it, not to respond, but to turn it completely off, the screen going dark in his hand. And when he placed it down again, there was a finality to the gesture, a quiet decision that whatever came next would not follow the old pattern. And Emily watched without comment, her expression unchanged but her eyes sharper, aligned. And as the city outside moved steadily under clear lights, the storm fully passed. Daniel Whitmore understood something that no boardroom had ever taught him. That control was not about holding every piece. It was about recognizing the one piece that changed everything. And as he stepped away from the table, his path no longer uncertain, one truth settled quietly behind him. The people who tried to outsmart him had already made one mistake. They assumed he was alone, and they had not seen her standing there the entire time.